We're an affordable housing advocacy organization, and unlike a trade association, we have coalition members. We have organizations who actually pay dues, and so our membership is not, you just wanting to be a member. They're actually organizational members. They're all nonprofits. They're all one way or the other in the housing community. Some are developers. Others may own properties, but focus much more on direct services for special needs populations. Others do various kinds of wraparound services or just general housing advocacy and policy. And so it's a coalition of the affordable housing community in San Francisco. And there's a few organizations that are not part of our coalition, but most are. Tend to very much focus on San Francisco. It's a laboratory for so much good progressive community development work, and it's been quite almost a national example of being able to get things done locally. We very much believe in the idea of thinking globally and acting locally, which is where a lot of your political levers are, is at the local level, particularly in the United States and particularly in California, which has an extremely parochialized structure of regulatory control over development, which is where the rubber hits the road in our work. But we've also, in the last couple of years in particular, started to kind of scale out our field of view from our local work and see what's happening in the region and beyond. Because there's a lot of discussion about an environmentally driven change, paradigm shift to the way we develop and where we develop and what we develop, with the sort of uncontested notion that California's population is going to continue to grow, and it's a very fast-growing population, and the Bay Area will grow quite dramatically as well, and there's nothing that can be done to stem the tide of population growth. It's just driven by macro factors that you just have to accept. This is the basic notion. And so it comes down much more to growth and development policy than it does, it comes down to development policy and land use policy than it does about population growth policy. And the idea has been, this is probably not news to you, that in California, no different than the rest of the country, we've had a half a century or more of essentially a habit of a very horizontal development pattern, where in a country that's fairly large for a relatively small population, we have chewed up a tremendous amount of our landscape by building a very low density, very auto-dependent, urbanized environment. I think I saw once recently that depending on how you define a suburb versus a city or a town, that something like 80 or 85% of the American population lives in what could be called a suburb. So we have a very suburbanized populace. The thought has been, how do you gently more urbanize our landscape as we continue to develop, with the notion that we're going to have this growing population. It's all cool. It all is sort of hard to reject unless you're an absolute ideologue against the idea of any kind of densification, which there are folks out there. But in our Bay Area, that idea resonates more strongly because there's a sense of its benefit to the environment, of being able to take train to work as opposed to driving, all those natural arguments. And this has been called smart growth, or sustainable communities, or infill development. I don't know, the environmental community and the design community, frankly, new urbanism, have come up with all sorts of labels for the same thing, putting more growth, more development into fewer places, and efficiently using land, and expecting that our development is going to start going more vertical than it is just horizontal, right? So we get more multifamily housing, we get more mixed-use type of development, we get areas that are not single zone, but actually zoned for multiple kinds of uses, et cetera, et cetera. It's not a new or particularly rocket science idea. Where we come at it is, well, okay, as Jason said, who benefits from this? There's clearly, at least a theoretical, environmental benefit. You reduce the distance that people have to drive to work. People can actually access more services locally. You actually have, less of your land that's at risk of being paved over. That has both immediate and sort of long-term environmental benefits, and you reduce the amount of carbon emissions. But who exactly benefits from that? And it's a very difficult question to answer, because the environment isn't a human stakeholder, right? And so in many respects, the environment is a classless thing. There's no upper class and working class and poor environment. The environment's the environment. Houses don't necessarily have class status, but the folks who actually access the benefits of this kind of patterns of change are not all the same. And as a good friend of mine has said, life is not like checkers, We're not all just the same equal pieces. Unfortunately, it's like chess. And we have to recognize that we do have systems where when we do our best to invest and make smart policy, that doesn't necessarily mean that everybody has access to those good outcomes. So I want to shift, so that's the kind of the big picture. Again, no answers, just lots of good, friendly debate over policy framed in that way. Who benefits? In the Bay Area, this notion of smart growth has been around for a good 20 plus years, and something that's been written about. The Greenbelt Alliance has written reports back to the mid-'80s. I was on their board for a while, so it's not a new notion. But in the last 2-3 years in particular, we've had a lot of traction around this, because it's now almost codified. If folks are familiar with legislation that was passed under the Schwarzenegger administration, it was a landmark, still referred to as landmark legislation by California to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It was an Assembly Bill 32, AB 32, called the Climate Change Act. And very, very simply, it said that in this kind of staggered two-phase time period, California would reduce its overall emissions that contribute to global warming by certain set amounts. And so the Air Resources Board has been given these target numbers that you shall achieve X emissions in pounds per whatever it is by year, I think it's by year 2015, and then another by 2035. And then how to get that done is they sort of ratcheted all the way back, of course, to the more local level, because land use decisions, both around point source pollution as well as around mobile pollution, happen primarily at the local level. But the state set those bars, and it's still considered the most aggressive or radical or progressive piece of state legislation in the country. A companion bill to that was something that came out of the Senate, Senate Bill 375. And the idea is that at least a significant part of the air emissions in California are those mobile source pollutants. You can take all the Chevron refineries you want, put scrubbers on them, and figure out ways to reduce their output, which there are, best practices and whatnot. But the other part of it is that folks are driving around in vehicles, right? And so cars and light truck emissions are tremendous. Even if you were to assume that delivery vehicles and others are sort of not going to change dramatically, you look at just, us as commuters, individuals making movements around, it's a very, very significant share of the air emissions. So SB 375 gave this basically a smart growth roadmap to how California regions, Bay Area and the 6 other regions, should set in place policies that in turn either push or incentivize local governments to change the way that they approve development so that we have less driving and less driving distance. Everything is measured. I'm not a real wonky person, but I know this now enough to know how it works. Everything is measured in vehicle miles traveled, VMTs. So the environmentalists and the transportation advocates are running around talking about VMTs. And that's just reducing not only the number of trips, so you can walk to the store sometimes rather than driving, but also the distance. That all boils down to VMT, which you can model as in terms of emissions output, and then you hit those magic numbers. So the regional governments, Metropolitan Transportation Commission and the Association of Area Governments in our region, one of 6 in the state, have been tasked with this rather Herculean goal of figuring out how to basically push a really significant change in land use development patterns to achieve these state emissions targets that were set by the governor and the legislature. And they've been doing this now for the last couple of years. The reason I brought these maps is because I want to show you where we have approached this and said to ourselves, wait a minute, something's missing in this picture. This map over here, and pardon me, it's a little crude and you probably have to squint your eyes, shows, the Bay Area. You can kind of point it at and pick it out, but it shows some orange blobs. The orange blobs are what they've referred to as priority development areas. Now, one of the funny things about these is they're self-defined by local government. It just gives you another indication of how parochial land use authority is in California. Jurisdictions have to say themselves, we think this is a nice area to focus, more intense growth. So San Francisco tends to be a very, believe it or not, pro-growth city. So you can see lots of San Francisco's east side has been self-identified as PDAs, priority development areas. Other jurisdictions which are kind of anti-growth, of course, they're not necessarily going to sign up for a priority development area. There's a psychology. But nevertheless, these orange blobs are generally seen as places where most of the future development in the Bay Area should go. They should go here. They're modeling these ranging anywhere from 70% of all future growth in the next 30 years would go into those orange blobs. 70%. It's 900,000 households is the projection for that growth, population growth between now and 2035. And 70% of that, whoever's got a calculator, would go in those orange blobs. And the other 30 would go somewhere right around them. To, a somewhat more modest model, which would be about 55 to 60% of the growth would go in those orange blobs. To give you a sense of comparison, right now it's less than 50. About maybe 50% or less of development goes into urbanized core, priority areas. The rest of it's just suburban sprawl. So that's a big, big shift of expectation. But that's the idea. And there's a whole planning process and policies and hearings and studies and whatnot. And the end result is something that we're going to produce called a sustainable communities strategy. Literally a thing. It'll be a document. I actually brought, a rough draft of at least a portion of it. They're calling it the Jobs Housing Connection Scenario. But this is a piece of what will be literally a document that will, at the end of the day, have some component parts and will say sustainable community strategy for the Bay Area, whatever, some kind of thing. So there's a document that's going to basically give a set of policies and incentives, carrots and sticks, to achieve this kind of scenario. What's wrong with the picture? This is another map that the regional agencies produced at some point, which shows in the same geography of the Bay Area, it maps out existing communities where they are calling there are communities of concern. Communities of concern, by their definition, people put labels on these things, is whatever the set percentage is, but it's some majority percentage of low-income population and or people of color. So you have this kind of nexus. Basically it's the poor communities where you tended to have, because of our economic segregation historically, higher percentages of folks of color. And in San Francisco, it's much of the east and southeast, and down in San Jose, over in Oakland, Richmond, Berkeley waterfront, up in here around Vallejo and along the I-80 corridor, out here into Pittsburgh. In many respects, if you've been around the Bay Area for at least 5 or 10 years, and you've left San Francisco, you kind of know these communities, right? They instinctively are places where you would imagine that there's probably communities of concern. Well, they've mapped them all out in kind of this cool thing, and we started looking at this map and this map, and we said, what if you actually put them on top of each other, right? And they finally came out with an overlay map, and this is even harder to read. But if you, again, squint your eyes, and pretend purple and blue and orange are essentially all the same. They're, one is both low income and community of color, another is community of color, another is low income. But let's just, for now, consider them all generically communities of concern. That's all the colored spots. The yellow hashing are these, the priority development areas, where most of the growth is to be focused. Well, it's a pretty good overlap. Not one for one, but there's a lot of overlap. And there's a logic to this, because these are the old urbanized areas of the Bay Area pre-war, pre-suburban sprawl that were good infill areas. They were close to transit, they were close to jobs, right? They were close to parts of the service community that you need to live and work. I mean, that was frankly the kind of working class environment of old San Francisco. You could live in the Mission, you could have a job in the Northeast Mission, and you could have all the services you would need on Mission Street or on 24th. It was a smart growth community, right? So we're basically turning the clock around and saying, gee, the way we used to live is the way we really should be living into the future for environmental purposes. The problem is those communities in many respects have become poor and working class communities because they were the folks who didn't have as much choice but to stay in those places. And the middle and upper classes moved out to these more kind of sprawling environments. So if you look at it optically like that, and I know this is a bit of a polemic, but it's a bit of a train wreck of assuming that so much growth will go back into communities where there's a lot of vulnerability to displacement and folks who are not the haves for the most part, but more of the have-nots. And how will they actually enjoy the benefits of all that, and it's mostly private investment, all that private investment in development in these communities. We don't know the answer. All we're pointing out is we're framing the problem statement that should be, frankly, an expectation that the sustainable community strategy, at least the thinking behind it and the policies that come out, should be cognizant of this reality and not try to sort of pretend it away, and be very sensitive about a very kind of optimistic set of expectations that we're going to achieve this simply for environmental purposes, and that the potential social cost would be part of the collateral damage. There should be some incredible sensitivity around what we're signing up for here, and not pit the environment against social equity. So that's how we come at this whole process. I just want to, for a second, and then I'll shut up and maybe we can chat, drill way down to the local level. What happens at the site level, which is where a lot of my friends who are architects, designers, they're working on something that's so small in scale compared to this. If this is hugely abstract, and this is futuresque, and you've got a project that's on deadline, and you've got to hit certain marks, in the next 6 months. It's the same thing. I mean, in many respects, it's the execution of this philosophy at ground level. Who exactly is a particular project serving? I mean, I know you folks do work that's international, but if you sort of take a typical local project in San Francisco and you're designing it and you're putting all kinds of good energy and ideas into it and you're thinking about its physical characteristics, the question becomes, what's the social context for that particular project that's being worked on? And this is not to be antagonistic, but one of the things that's been a struggle for us in relating to the architecture community and really feeling like we're embracing a shared sense of principles is that green has been very much focused on the physical aspects of development and design and location and all this other cool stuff, and has not really had a component that's about its use and the people and the notion of community. And our argument is that displacement of folks from a community by new development isn't really a green outcome, no matter how green the building is. I want to give you an example of that. I just say I would stop talking, but I got one more map. Who was here in the dot-com boom, as they call it, this sort of mid-90s through, say, the early 2000s? Anyone else? Okay, so this was a pretty hot zone around here, as was the Mission District. I happen to have a map that's focused on the Mission District, just as an example of what what this is data from San Francisco's Rent Stabilization Board. Some people call it rent control. It's actually rent stabilization. We have a whole office, and evictions, at least ones that are legal, are actually tracked, and there's data on that, and they're categorized. And I had a whole other sheet that goes back to about 1994 or 5, so it was the kind of preceding 6, 7, 8 years. But this is 98 to 2001. This is a 3-year tranche of data. This is when the dot-com boom was really, hitting it. And then this is 2002 to 2005. But to give you an idea of its site level, what happens, these are all evictions that happen over that 3-year period. Again, they're just legal evictions. And I don't know if anybody's a renter, but stuff happens offline, so to speak. These are the ones that were reported and were above board and legally allowable. The red dots are demolitions, right? So this is something going down and something new coming up. So you have a displacement of an existing occupant to develop a new project. Who it's serving? Good question. The blue ones are owner move-in evictions, which doesn't have to do with development in any way. So it's not a kind of development-driven, but it's owners, if you will, reoccupying parts of their buildings or some of their family and displacing existing tenants. And then the greens are Ellis Act evictions, which was something that by state law really took off in the late 90s, allowing rental property owners to actually go out of business, and in the process they could evict all of the tenants from a building, and then that building could eventually be converted into condominiums and sold as ownership housing. So in all these kinds of categories of evictions, you can see how that continues to chart out. It starts to drop a little bit as we get into that recessionary period, a little dip in the early 2000s. But this is the movement of people. Some folks get pushed out, other folks come in. And so at the site level, you can actually have that as a backdrop for the communities that you might be working in. What's happening around here that is if you will, the policy context for the actual work that's being done on an individual site. And I'm not sure if that question's asked or if it even is relevant, but I think for us it's made the whole green conversation a little bit of a struggle. I think architects, designers, planners can be advocates, and they can be social equity advocates, that big lumpy thing. And frankly, that's not, there's folks from the health community, folks from the affordable housing community, folks from the economic development, the organizing and community empowerment. There's all sorts of, communities of advocacy interests who are pushing this kind of general frame of social equity in the work that gets done, right? I think one of the things that's possible to do is just to have that as a kind of recognizing that as a backdrop to your work, and being able to have that as part of your narrative about what you're doing. You're doing a project, so you're given certain parameters you have very little control over. But to even understand that social backdrop and be able to articulate it and push, I think is a huge step. It makes your community advocates that take a certain amount of risk around the comfort of just doing your work, just like we all do, right? And that's the notion of being an advocate, is not accepting what's given to you, but pushing for positive social change. It's still kind of abstract, but I think that's just a mindset that everybody can take. I'll just continue on that. A lot of the biggest boosters for this do come out of the architecture and design community. New urbanism has absolutely, almost wholeheartedly, embraced this as the answer to everything, with very, very little kind of social equity frame built into it. So just even shifting that and becoming more progressive within the design communities and stuff. At a real process level, this sustainable communities strategy effort has, hearings, they have documents, they have advisory groups, they do focus groups. It again, it's the kind of stuff, if you aren't really paying attention to that, it could all be going on, you wouldn't know it. But if folks are really interested, you can get involved and have a point of view. You know, comment on the policy documents that are coming out like this and say, hey, you know, from a design and architecture standpoint, there's something missing, or here's a friendly feedback, or, you know, be able to attend a hearing at the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, which are very, very wonky kind of things, and give a little bit of that ground level reality back to folks. So there's a way to participate. Usually it's a matter of time.
Well, thanks so much for coming.
Sure.
Appreciate it.